There was a time when a man's word meant everything, when a father's sacrifice was enough to carry a whole family forward. But what happened on Family Feud one quiet Thursday afternoon in October 2023 would shake Steve Harvey to his core. When a 52-year-old man named Gerald Washington stepped up to that podium, nobody in that studio expected what was coming. Gerald wasn't there for the money. He wasn't there for the cameras. He was there because he had made a promise to a dying woman, and he intended to keep it. Steve Harvey had hosted Family Feud for over a decade. He had seen tears, laughter, shocking answers, and unforgettable moments. But when Gerald opened his mouth and began telling the truth about his family, Steve Harvey stopped the game entirely. He couldn't continue. And by the time Gerald finished speaking, there wasn't a dry eye in that studio. Gerald Washington was 52 years old, born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama. He was a big man, broad shoulders, calloused hands, the kind of man who looked like he had been working hard his whole life. That's because he had. For 27 years, Gerald had worked as a maintenance supervisor at a public school district. Not a glamorous job, not a high-paying job. But Gerald showed up every single day without complaint. Gerald came to Family Feud with 5 members of his family. His 2 adult sons, Marcus and Devont, his teenage daughter Aaliyah, and his elderly father, James Washington, who sat in the front row of the audience. The Washington family had dressed up for the occasion. Gerald in a dark blue suit he had bought specifically for the show, his sons in button-down shirts, his daughter in a yellow dress she had picked out herself. What the audience didn't know yet was why the family was really there. Gerald's wife, Denise Washington, had passed away 14 months earlier after a 3-year battle with breast cancer. Denise had been the heartbeat of the Washington family, a woman who cooked Sunday dinners for the entire neighborhood, who volunteered at her church every week, who wrote little notes and tucked them into her children's coat pockets. She was the kind of woman people described as pure love. Before Denise passed, she had made Gerald promise 2 things. The first was that he would keep the family together. The second was that he would take the family on one big adventure, something that would make them laugh together the way they used to, before the hospital visits, and the grief had settled like a heavy fog over their home. Gerald had applied to Family Feud because he believed, with everything in him, that Denise had wanted exactly this. What Gerald also didn't tell anyone was the financial reality he was facing. After years of paying medical bills, taking unpaid leave to care for Denise, and keeping up with household expenses on a single income, Gerald was drowning in debt. He owed over $60,000 in medical expenses that insurance had not fully covered. He was 2 months behind on his mortgage. His father, James, needed a hearing aid that cost $3,000, and Gerald had been telling him it wasn't that important, when really he just couldn't afford it. None of this was visible on Gerald's face when he shook Steve Harvey's hand and smiled that wide, warm smile. He had learned to carry his pain quietly. He had learned that from Denise. The Washington family started the game strong. Marcus, the older son, had quick instincts and a competitive edge that made the audience cheer. Devont brought the humor, giving an answer so unexpected in round 2 that even Steve Harvey had to stop and laugh. Aaliyah, just 17, answered her question with a maturity that impressed the entire studio. The family moved with the kind of easy comfort that only comes from real love. They finished each other's sentences. They leaned on each other. They laughed at inside jokes that no one else in the room understood. The Washington family won the main game convincingly. As they celebrated, Steve Harvey walked over to Gerald, the patriarch, the man whose name was on the application form, and said what he always said before fast money. "Tell me about your family." And that is where everything changed. Gerald looked at Steve. He took a slow breath. He looked at his boys, at his daughter, at his father in the front row. And then he said, quietly but clearly, "Mr. Harvey, I need to tell you the truth." Steve tilted his head slightly. He could hear something in Gerald's voice, not nerves, but weight. The kind of weight a person carries for a long time before they finally set it down. Gerald said, "My wife passed away 14 months ago. Her name was Denise. She fought cancer for 3 years, and she never once complained. She never once asked why. She just kept waking up every morning and loving us harder than the day before." The studio went quiet, not the polite quiet of an audience waiting for the next moment. The deep quiet of people who recognize real pain when they hear it. Gerald continued. "The night before she died, she held my hand and she told me not to let the family stop living. She said grief was okay, but she didn't want us to disappear into it. She said take the kids somewhere, laugh together, remind them that life is still good." He paused and looked down for just a moment. "I promised her I would." Steve Harvey had not moved. Stood perfectly still, microphone in hand, completely present. Gerald looked up again. His voice was steady, but his eyes were full. I applied to this show because I thought this was what she meant. I thought, what would Denise love? She would love watching her family on TV making fools of themselves in front of everybody. A small laugh moved through the audience, the kind of laugh that comes wrapped in tears. But I also need to tell you something else. Gerald's voice dropped slightly. I'm behind on my mortgage. I owe tens of thousands of dollars in medical bills. My father over there, he pointed gently to the front row where James Washington sat in a pressed shirt. He needs hearing aids and I haven't been able to get them for him because I can't afford it. I've been pretending to him that it's not a big deal, but it is. He's 78 years old and he can't hear his grandchildren clearly. That was the moment Steve Harvey's composure cracked. He turned away from the camera, just for a few seconds. His shoulders moved. A producer later said that in 15 years of working in television, she had never seen anything like it. Steve Harvey, the man who made millions of people laugh every single day, stood on his own stage and couldn't find words. When he turned back, his eyes were red. He looked at Gerald and said, "Brother, why are you just now telling somebody this?" Gerald gave a small smile. "Because Denise always said, don't make yourself a burden on other people. Handle your business." But tonight, he glanced at his children, tonight I thought maybe she'd forgive me for saying it out loud. In the front row, James Washington had his hand over his mouth. Aaliyah was crying openly. Marcus had his arm around his little sister. Devon stared straight ahead, jaw tight, trying to hold himself together the way young men do when they've decided they need to be strong. Steve Harvey made a decision right there on that stage. Not a produced decision, not a planned moment, a real one. He called the Washington family over, all 5 of them, and he stood in the center of that group and spoke directly to the audience and the cameras. "I've been doing this a long time," he said. "And I'll tell you what I know. A man who works hard, keeps his promises, and protects his family even when everything is falling apart, that man is a hero. Gerald Washington is a hero, and we're not going to let a hero leave this stage without doing something right." The audience erupted. Steve raised his hand for quiet. "Gerald, I want you to hear me. This game show, that's fine, that's entertainment. But what you just did, telling the truth about your family in front of millions of people, that took more courage than anything I've seen on this stage." He paused. "Denise raised a good man, and she raised good children. I can see that." Gerald could no longer hold it together. He pressed his fist to his mouth and looked at the ceiling, the universal gesture of a man trying not to cry in public. His sons moved closer to him instinctively. Steve turned to the cameras. "I want everyone watching this right now to know about Gerald Washington. I want them to know that this man kept his promise to his wife. He brought his family here to laugh together, just like she asked. And I'm going to keep my own promise right now." He paused deliberately. "Gerald, whatever you win today in fast money, we're matching it. And I'm personally making sure your father gets those hearing aids. Today." The studio exploded. The audience stood. James Washington, 78 years old and hard of hearing, looked around in confusion at the reaction, and his grandson Devon crouched down beside him and explained what had just been said. James covered his face with both hands. Gerald looked at Steve Harvey and said simply, "I told Denise we'd come out here and make her proud." Steve nodded. "She's proud, I can promise you that." The fast money round itself became secondary, though the Washington family performed brilliantly. Marcus went first and scored 128 points. Gerald, calm and focused in a way that only comes from a man who has already said the hardest thing he'll ever say, answered his 5 questions deliberately and clearly, scoring 103 points, bringing the family total to 231, well above the threshold. The audience cheered with each answer as if it were a championship game. But everyone in that building knew the real victory had already happened before the buzzer sounded. The episode aired 6 weeks later, and within hours, the clip of Gerald's speech had been viewed over 12 million times. The comment sections of every platform were filled with people sharing their own stories of loss, of holding families together, of keeping promises to people who were no longer there to see them kept. James Washington received his hearing aids within a week of the taping. A production assistant drove them to Birmingham personally. The first thing James said clearly to his grandchildren was Devon's name, and Devon, 24 years old and as tough as they come, sat down on the kitchen floor and sobbed. The show's legal team worked with Gerald to address the mortgage arrears and create a structured payment plan for the medical debt. The prize money, doubled as promised, went directly to clearing the most urgent of those bills. Gerald later said it felt like setting down a weight he had been carrying so long he had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. Aaliyah Washington, 17 years old and quietly observing everything, wrote a school essay about her mother 3 weeks after the episode aired. Her English teacher submitted it to a regional writing competition. It won first place. When the teacher called to tell Gerald, He sat in his car in the school parking lot for 20 minutes before he could drive home. Steve Harvey spoke about the Washington family on his radio show the week after the episode aired. He told his listeners, "That man got up there and told the truth. He didn't dress it up. He didn't ask for anything. He just told the truth. And I want every person listening to understand that's what dignity looks like. That's what love looks like when it keeps going even after it hurts." 6 months after the original taping, Family Feud invited the Washington family back for a follow-up segment. Gerald walked onto the stage looking different. Lighter was the word everyone used. He had paid off the most pressing bills. His father could hear properly for the first time in years. Marcus had gotten a promotion at work. Devon had enrolled in a community college course he had put off for 2 years. And Aaliyah had been accepted to her first-choice university on a partial academic scholarship. Steve Harvey welcomed them back personally. "I told you Denise would be proud," he said, shaking Gerald's hand. "You want to tell me I was wrong?" Gerald shook his head slowly. "No, sir, you weren't wrong." The Washington family had also started something quietly, almost without intending to. After the episode aired, Gerald had been contacted by dozens of widowers and single parents across the country, men and women who had watched the show and felt seen for the first time in years. He had started a small online group, nothing organized or official, just a space where people could talk honestly about raising families after loss. By the 6-month mark, over 4,000 people had joined. Gerald named the group after something Denise used to say when things were hard. She would look at whoever was struggling and say, "Keep the lights on." It meant, stay present, stay warm, don't shut down. Keep the lights on for the people who need to find their way home to you. 1 year after the episode, on the anniversary of Denise's passing, Gerald took his children and his father to a restaurant they had never been able to afford before. They ordered whatever they wanted. James heard every word of every conversation. Aaliyah brought a photo of Denise in her favorite dress and put it on the table next to the salt and pepper. Nobody spoke about grief that night. They just lived loudly, warmly, fully, exactly the way Denise had asked. Gerald told a reporter who asked about the Family Feud experience, "Denise always said the truth sets things free. I didn't understand what she meant until I stood up there and said out loud what our life had been like. I felt something lift." And then everything started to move again. Steve Harvey, in his end-of-year reflection on his radio program, returned to the moment with Gerald Washington one more time. "I've been asking families questions on that stage for years," he said. "But that night, one man answered a question nobody even asked him. He answered the question of what it means to be a father, what it means to be a son, what it means to keep a promise, and he answered it perfectly." The Washington family's story had started with loss and continued through silence and struggle. But it found its resolution the way the best stories do, not through luck or miracles, but through one honest moment, spoken out loud by a man who had nothing left to hide and everything left to protect. Denise Washington had asked Gerald to keep the lights on. He had kept them on. And by telling the truth on that stage, he had lit something that spread far beyond his own family, a reminder to everyone watching that real strength doesn't look like never breaking. Real strength looks like breaking open, telling the truth, and then getting back up to finish what love started.